Ocock. Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. Posted by UDR Mantis Toboggan 7 months ago. Being neighborly. Ocock. Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. Young drushed cock-a-doodled into the air, and people woke up, eager for their day's work. Farron got out of bed and helped his father feed their forge, made sure all the ingots were ready and accessible, cleaned all the tools of any dust, and opened large doors at the end of the room to ensure good airflow. That's when Farron noticed how quiet the town was. Instead of the usual line of farmers asking that their plow blades or horseshoes be mended or replaced, Farron was faced with an empty street. Curiosity pushed Farron to step further out of the forge, and he saw a group of villagers at the center of town. He gained permission from his father to see what was going on, and approached the small crowd, seeing it was centered around a trio of saurus, tall reptilian people that were twice the size of a regular folk. And at their feet was the mayor, dead. Which is why you should thank us. Clearly, he was too weak to protect you from bandits and raiders, which is why we felt it was our duty to step in. One of the saurus was saying, his scales brighter and healthier compared to the other 2. This is the part where you thank us, said the tallest one, towering over the mayor's wife. The mayor's wife looked up, anger and fear visible to Farron, but she slowly choked out a "THTH thank you" before she burst into tears. Why, you don't seem to be that grateful. No smile, no song, no dance. Why, maybe me ought to help you out, said the third, who sported a gold ring on his left index finger. Before anyone could reply, his hand flew to his belt and drew a knife, launching it inches from the kneeling folk's foot. She jumped back in surprise as the saurus laughed, and the other 2 joined in, throwing knives at her feet to make her move around, doing her best to avoid being hit. The saurus laughed, a horrible and cruel laugh, until Farron heard a shout from behind him. Hey, egg humpers! Farron turned around to see his father standing in the road, calmly walking towards the trio of saurus, carrying his crossbow. Why don't you 3 point out which one killed the mayor and I'll let the other 2 of YA go. The saurus stopped their chortling, and looked at each other. Bright Scales stepped forwards. Well, neighbor, that sounded like a threat. Are you threatening us? Farron's father nodded. I suppose I am. Well, for the threat to be legitimate, you have to be showing intent to harm. Why don't you make it official and point that boltcaster our way? Farron's father was confused, but complied. I suppose I'll do you dash, he spoke, his speech interrupted by a knife to the throat. Farron hadn't even seen the sauri's hand move. One moment it was near his hip and the second it was extended towards Farron's father. The sauri walked up to Farron. Young man, you just witnessed what happened, didn't you? He asked, placing a hand on Farron's shoulders. Farron nodded, otherwise paralyzed by fear. You heard him threaten me, and point his crossbow at me, didn't you? Farron nodded again. So we agree it's self-defense then? That wasn't a question. Farron nodded anyways. He'd always be ashamed of that final nod. Good. Now why don't you pick up that dagger of mine for me, like a good neighbor should? Shink. 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 Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range. The only things getting in the way were the tall post to which Farron's neighbor was tied up. Farron had been forced to build that post, dig a hole for it, and supply the necessary rope. He hadn't been forced to. The saurus had asked him to do it as a neighborly favor. Farron knew what happened to those who weren't neighborly. Shink. 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 Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the three moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range. The only thing getting in the way was the smoke from Rigel's house as it burned. He hadn't been neighborly when the Saurus had asked for one of his courts. Hink. Shink. 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 Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the three moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. The people of Clear River had learned to be neighborly. Shink. 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 Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the three moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the clouds never got in the way. But the quiet of the lonely road into Clear River was disturbed by the steps of a newcomer. Shink. 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 The door of the tavern creaked as a newcomer entered. He was tall as a Sauri, but had the skin and a full rounded face of a folk. He wasn't as muscular as an orc, but he was halfway there. His head was covered by a wide-brimmed straw hat, and wore simple trousers, and on his back was a simple traveler's pack. His torso, however, was covered by some kind of quilt, tucked up around his neck, and ended halfway down his thigh. The newcomer surveyed the tavern, and saw that it was empty, save for the bartender, and a Sauri with bright scales. The newcomer approached the bar, sat on a stool, and his hand emerged from the slit on the side of his covering, with a trio of copper coins. The folk, happy to see payment, scurried over and asked what the newcomer wanted. Something local. The folk nodded, and a minute later placed a tankard in front of the newcomer. The Sauri observed the newcomer drink, then drunkenly got up, staggered over, and sat down next to him. "Well, howdy. You're new here, aren't you?" The newcomer said nothing. "Well, since you're new to Clear River, I just want to let you know how things are around here. You see, we all try to be neighbor dash. Can I smoke here?" The newcomer asked the bartender, ignoring bright scales. The bartender just nodded and scurried into the storeroom, terrified of getting involved. "Now, interrupting isn't very neighborly," the Sauri said. The newcomer pulled out a pipe and gently jammed sweet leaf into it. "Well, you're right, how can I expect a newcomer to know about our customs? Such as our non-resident smoking tax." The newcomer pulled out a tinderbox and lit the sweet leaf, gently inhaling it. Bright scales ogled the tinderbox with obvious jealousy. "Now that is a fine device, friend. Where did you get it?" The newcomer, for the first time, turned to Bright Scales. "Killed a taxman," he said, blowing smoke into the Sauri's face. Bright Scales was stunned for a moment, then laughed. "Well, friend, it sounds like you're a dangerous element. And we don't like dangerous elements in Clear River. So why don't you give the town a gift of friendship to show us you mean no harm?" The newcomer reached out again, and placed 3 more copper coins on the table. Bright Scales grinned, and reached for them, only to find that the newcomer was gripping his wrist. "They're for the drink. Not you." The newcomer let go, got up, went around the bar, and poured himself another drink. Bright Scales decided to reach for the coins again, when his hand bumped into something. He looked down and saw that it was a knife embedded in the bar top. It hadn't been there when the newcomer got up. And Bright Scales hadn't seen the newcomer throw it. Bright Scales had had enough. It was bad enough that his companions had left him here to watch the town while they went hunting, but now this asshole was disrespecting him. "Well, looks like you're determined to not be neighborly. So I think we should take this outside." "Why, your fists don't work indoors?" the newcomer asked, not even looking up. The Sauri grew angrier, reached to his knife belt, and threw his dagger at the newcomer. The Sauri was too drunk to fully register what had happened, but there was a loud crack, and the next thing Bright Scales knew, his dagger was clattering on the floor. The newcomer calmly walked over to the dagger, drink in hand, picked it up, and walked over to the Sauri. "You dropped this," he said, jamming it into the table. He reached out with a silver coin, placed it on the bar top, and spoke loud enough for the terrified bartender to hear. "The silver's for the knife marks left tonight on this nice wood." The newcomer turned to Bright Scales, making eye contact. "Just being neighborly." The newcomer turned and made for the door, finishing his drink as he walked, and placed the tankard on the table nearest to the exit. Bright Scales simmered with rage, then leapt up after the newcomer. He followed him outside, pulled out his knife, and shouted at the newcomer. "Hey, asshole!" The newcomer saw Bright Scales throw the knife, his aim unhindered by his inebriation, but once more there was a loud crack and the dagger fell onto the ground. Bright Scales, alongside the residents who were peering out of their windows, saw what had made the noise. A whip now lay on the ground, trailing from under the newcomer's covering. One time is an accident. Second time is a coincidence. Third time makes it serious, the newcomer said. He didn't shout, but his voice carried to all the observers. Bright Scales realized that the newcomer wasn't any traveler or wanderer. Bright Scales needed to do something, to save face. Bright Scales suddenly had a fantastic idea. 2 knives. Bright Scales got into position, his hands poised to draw and throw, before the newcomer spoke again. "Before we continue, you should go back and pay for your drinks." Bright Scales smirked. "I don't pay for my drinks." "You will." Before the newcomer could say anything else, Bright Scales reached to his belt and threw a dagger with each hand. Crack. As expected, the human had managed to knock one dagger out of the air. Bright Scales looked at where the second one ought to have hit, before he realized that the human had grabbed hold of the second one. Then Bright Scales realized that there was a lump in his throat. Not a metaphorical one from fear, but something tangible. He tried to reach for the knife in his throat. His hand never got that far. The newcomer walked over to the Sauri's corpse, retrieved his knife, collected Bright Scales' coin purse, and entered the bar. When he came out, he walked straight for Farron's home, and knocked on the door of the forge. Farron slowly opened the door, and saw a silver coin in the newcomer's outstretched hand. "Prepare a pyre." Farron nodded, accepted the coin, and watched the newcomer leave. "Be careful. His friends will come after you," Farron shouted after the newcomer. The newcomer stopped. "How many more?" "2 others." Farron jumped at the sound of 2 more silver coins landing by his feet, and watched with awe as the newcomer walked away from Clear River. And Farron knew, no matter what happened, that he'd remember for the rest of his life the noise the newcomer made with each step. Shink. 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 Part 2. Being neighborly, 2/3. Oh. Sunrise over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains framed the sun, the 3 moons aligned with the tallest summits of the range. The only thing getting in the way was the smoke from Bright Scales' funeral pyre as it burned. The other 2 Saurus were not as enraged as Farron had feared, as they seemed genuinely thankful for the pyre. Apparently in Sauri culture, when a warrior died, his body was burned and the ashes were used as war paint for the next hunt. Farron had no idea if the stranger who had killed Bright Scales knew about this when he commissioned the pyre. Farron didn't want to tell the 2 remaining Saurus that Farron had been commissioned to make pyres for them as well. Worst case scenario, he was up 2 silvers. Best case scenario, Clear River would be free from the Saurus. Win-win. The Saurus watched the flames diminish over the day, mourning their fallen comrade. They spent almost an hour finger-painting each other and chanting in their hissing and howling language. And when they were done, they attached to themselves only their knife belts, and in the shorter one's case, his golden ring. The Saurus slowly strode out of Clear River, and began stalking into the nearby forest. Goldringer went north, towards the mountains, while the taller one went south, following the direction of the only road out of town, which the stranger had last been seen walking down. Halsey was enraged. He and his brother had only left town for a couple of hours, and some asshole had gone and killed his other brother. At least the asshole had honor. That as his one saving grace. He'd paid for the funeral pyre, and in return Halsey would make this guy's death quick and painless. Halsey followed the road for quite some time until he finally spotted a trail leading eastwards, towards the river the town took its name from. Staying low, Halsey followed the tracks, making sure to stay as aware as possible as he could of his surroundings. Sure, now he occupied the step on the societal ladder above bully but below roaming brigand, but he and his brothers had once been his den tribe's greatest hunters. Halsey felt smug as he spotted the first trap. A simple snare, barely camouflaged against the underbrush. Halsey stepped over it, and continued onwards. 2 more traps, in a straight line, almost as if Halsey's prey knew he was coming. Halsey suppressed a scoff. Any experienced hunter would have put them in spots with more animal traffic. Halsey stalked the stranger's trail, and eventually reached the edge of the forest, where the trees stopped for about 10 meters, and then the ground sloped downwards for 2 meters to meet the river. And right besides the river, he spotted the stranger's tent. And right there, right outside the tent, was the stranger, sleeping, laying down on the sloping riverbank, hat angled on his head to protect his face from the sun. Unfortunately for him, it also prevented him from seeing anyone at a higher elevation. Halsey approached the top of the slope, silently pulled out a knife from his belt, held it high, gave a silent prayer to the brother he'd be avenging and a silent gloat to the brother he'd be beating, and then dropped the knife as he felt immense pain from something stabbing him in the back. Halsey jumped to the side just in time to avoid a second thrown knife. He looked behind him and saw, perched at the top of a tree, dressed in only his breeches and his knife belt, was the stranger. Halsey cursed himself as he roared and charged the tree, dodging the knives the stranger was throwing down at him, and began climbing, leaping from branch to branch, thankful that his height gave him a greater reach. He was a meter below the stranger, and pulled out a knife to try and stab his brother's killer, when his adversary did something unexpected. He jumped. It was at least a 10-meter fall, but only once the stranger had jumped did Halsey spot the rope in the stranger's hand, and watched as mid-leap the stranger turned and threw the rope, tied into a 1-knot noose, to grab onto a solid tree branch, and managed to land safely. Halsey scrambled to drop down quickly to not let his quarry escape, but the stranger had other plans. He approached the base of the tree's trunk, in which were 3 small holes that Halsey hadn't noticed in his fury. The stranger retrieved 2 pieces of flint from a pouch on his belt knife and smashed them against each other, shaving sparks down the small hole, and creating a muffled bang inside the tree. Halsey heard the first noise, recognizing it as blasting powder. He felt the second shake the tree. After the third, the tree began to sway westwards, towards the road. Halsey rushed to climb down safely, but he was barely halfway down the tree when its toppling was blocked by an adjacent tree, causing him to be launched straight towards the hard ground. He couldn't tell if it was moments or hours later, but Halsey regained consciousness, and sat up. He was hurting, his left wrist wasn't working right, and his head pounded, but at least he was alive. He stood up and looked for the stranger, spotting him by the top of the riverbank slope. The stranger just stood there, hands above his knife belt, the warning very clear: walk away, or else. Halsai knew that he would lose a knife-throwing fight against the stranger now that his throwing hand was out of commission. That left only one option. Halsai rushed forwards, putting his hands up to provide cover for his head and body, keeping as low to the ground as his tall frame would allow, and charged the stranger as fast as he could. The stranger just stood there, nowhere to run, and flung knife after knife towards Halsai, who either dodged them or let his forearms take the hit. And when he finally reached the stranger, Halsai grabbed him by the waist and pushed them both down the riverbank, rolling and tumbling into the water. Halsai felt the stranger stab him once in the side, but the Sauri was too enraged to care, and instead focused on grappling the stranger and keeping him under the water. Saurians were apex predators in swamps and marshes, and could hold their breath for up to an hour. He doubted that the stranger could do the same, given that he was by Halsai's estimation just a taller halfling. Halsai managed to get around behind the stranger, looping his powerful arms under the stranger's armpits, and clasping his fingers together behind the stranger's back. His tail snaked out through his legs and curled around the stranger's, forcing them together. Finally Halsai just lay back, his nostrils closing themselves to not let any water in, while the strangers began streaming precious air towards the river's surface. Halsai reveled in his inevitable victory, momentarily distracted from the stranger's arms. After all, what could he do without his knives? Stick his fingers in Halsai's eye apparently. Halsai roared with pain, the sound muffled and distorted by the water, and the stranger pushed his fingers deeper into Halsai's eye socket, grasped his whole right eye, and pulled. Halsai let go of the stranger as he saw the stranger let go of his eye and release it to be carried off by the river's current. The stranger took advantage of this, and began wading over to where he'd set up camp, gaining a head start while Halsai recovered from his latest injury. The Sauri stood up and roared, a sound that made nearby birds flee from their perches, as he followed the stranger, his longer stride allowing him to catch up and tackle the stranger, knocking him onto his front, his head barely entering his tent. Halsai flipped him over, and punched him in the face. The stranger raised his left hand to block the next one. Halsai gave him a left hook to the ribs, feeling something crack. The stranger reached out with his right hand, trying to reach a bag inside the tent. Halsai grabbed his left wrist, twisted it out of the way, and punched him in the mouth again. The stranger spat out a tooth, and found what he was searching for. Halsai punched him in the eye, then stopped in shock as he felt the stranger hit him in the face. It didn't hurt. But he felt the impact, felt something push against his closed empty eye socket, until his eyelid gave way. He looked down at the human. The human just grinned an ugly grin, bloody and missing teeth, and reached forward with a tinderbox. Click. FWSHHHHHHHHH. Halsai heard something making an unfamiliar sound. He identified it as a rope, trailing from his eye socket, the end set alight, and the fire trailing upwards unnaturally quick. He realized what was inside his eye socket and panicked, but before he could do anything the stranger lifted up his legs, put his soles on Halsai's chest, and pushed. Halsai fell backwards, and spotted the stranger running over him and away, down the riverbank, as Halsai tried his best to gouge the blasting powder-filled bag out of his eye socket before its fuse reached the end. Bang! Once the blood and gore had finished flying through the sky, the stranger went back to his tent. He rummaged through his packs and found a healing potion, downing it. Once he'd caught his breath, he put on his tunic, trousers, boots, and torso covering, retrieved all the knives he'd thrown around the place, and put on his hat, adjusting it at just the right angle. He began walking back into Clear River, each step accompanied by the sound of knives clinking against each other. Shink. 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 Being neighborly, 3/3. Ocock. Morning over Clear River was beautiful. The mountains shone in the light of the sun, the three moons only barely askew from being aligned with the tallest summits of the range, and the village stood silent in its appreciation of the natural beauty around it. That, and in the fear they held for the Saori kneeling in the village square. They'd all heard the explosion coming from the woods earlier this morning, in the direction where the Saori's taller brother had gone searching for their prey. They all assumed that the brother was dead, for more time had passed since the explosion than it would have taken the Saori to return. The remaining Saori heard it as well. He didn't mourn or rage, but rather went to the center of the village square, took off his knife belt, and took a few minutes to place his knives into the dirt all around him, after which he knelt down and waited. Then, in the silence, they heard it. Shink. 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 All eyes in the village turned to the newcomer as he approached the Saori, his smoking pipe in his mouth, each step accompanied by the jangle of the knives tapping against each other, his torso and arms hidden by the covering he wore around his neck. The Saori looked up from where he was kneeling, naked but for his loincloth and his golden ring, making eye contact with the newcomer. "Don't suppose there's any way we both walk away from this?" the newcomer asked, taking a puff from his pipe, stepping closer towards the Saori, entering the field of discarded knives. The Saori slowly shook his head, unblinking. The newcomer undid the button that kept up his covering, and let it slide to the ground, revealing a bandolier of knives covering his chest and back, a pouch and tinderbox on his left hip and his whip on his right. He took off his hat and deposited it on his discarded covering, alongside his pipe. The Saori then grinned and raised his hand, pushing all of the magic he'd been holding in his body from his meditation into the gold ring he wore, causing a blue rune to shine briefly. The same rune shone on the handle of a knife embedded in the ground behind the newcomer, at which point it floated out of the ground and began to fly towards the Saori. Its path ended prematurely as it pierced the newcomer in the back. The newcomer struggled to not yelp in pain as he removed the knife, tracking the Saori's movements. The Saori rushed forward to uppercut the newcomer, but the newcomer dodged at the last second. The Saori took advantage of this repositioning to activate his ring again, causing another knife to fly towards the newcomer from behind. This time the newcomer was ready, and sidestepped as soon as he saw the ring's rune glow. Then before the Saori could react, he stepped forward and blew the smoke from his last pipe puff into the Saori's face. The Saori coughed and spluttered as the smoke entered his mouth and coated his wet eyes, and began swinging wildly as he desperately licked his eyeballs clean. The newcomer took one much-needed breath of fresh air as he stepped out of the Saori's reach, then drew knives and began launching them at the Saori. To his dismay, the knife was stopped by a shimmering green barrier that appeared on the Saori's skin right before impact. He tried two more knives, but both had the same effect. He did notice, however, that every time the barrier appeared, a bright green rune on the ring would flash. The Saori grinned as his forked tongue cleared the last of the foreign material from his eye. He activated his ring once more, but the newcomer had been waiting for that, and he flung his knife at the Saori as soon as the blue rune flashed, thinking that the Saori couldn't run two enchantments active at the same time, as he didn't appear to be a mage. The newcomer sidestepped, narrowly dodging the knife that would have pierced him from behind had he been any slower, but was surprised to see that his latest projectile once more had no effect. "You probably thought that since I'm not a mage I couldn't have two enchantments active at the same time, right?" the Saori snarled. "You underestimate me as much as the mage I took this from. Surrender and I'll make this quick." The newcomer said nothing, flinging two more knives at the Saori, realizing what he had to do. The Saori was not a mage, and he wasn't consciously controlling the shield enchantment on his ring. And since he didn't have anywhere to store a source of mana on his person other than his loincloth, and didn't know how to properly collect mana from his surroundings, it meant that he was fueling the magic with his own body's energy. An energy that could be depleted. So the newcomer set his plan into motion, dodging knives coming from behind him, while launching his own at the Saori. For many long minutes he moved and dodged, receiving some scrapes and cuts for his efforts, always on the edge of being stabbed in the back again. Then he ran out of knives. In his defense, the newcomer had never faced foes that couldn't be dispatched by more than a dozen blades. And counting knives was difficult to do while dodging knives coming at you from behind. But none of this mattered. He didn't need knives. He reached for the whip on his hip. With a loud crack he snapped the tip of the whip into the Saori's shielding, once more doing no damage. The second attack with the whip missed, landing the coiled rope by the Saori's feet. Almost on instinct the newcomer flicked it to coil around the Saori's leg, and saw that it was held a few centimeters away from the Saori's skin by the shielding. But it wasn't deflected. The newcomer gave the whip's handle a tug and was delighted to see the Saori's leg be pulled with it, although the shimmering barrier around said leg held strong. The Saori tripped and fell awkwardly to one knee, and the newcomer took advantage of the lull in the Saori's attacks to kick him in the chin. Once more the shielding activated, but the Saori's head moved backwards from the momentum. Not as much as if the kick had connected, but enough that the newcomer realized that while the shield prevented the Saori's body from being attacked, it didn't completely absorb the force of his attacks. And just like that, the mystique of the shielding evaporated, the newcomer realizing that it was nothing more than weightless armor that would disappear if its wearer got tired enough. And the newcomer had fought armored foes aplenty. The newcomer leapt to the side as the Saori called forth another knife laying on the ground and spun as he did so, using his momentum to launch a particularly vicious strike with his whip into the enchantment, then dodged forward and attempted to headbutt the Saori. Oddly enough his forehead didn't hurt from the effort. The closest sensation he could describe would be if the portion of his forehead that touched the enchantment encountered a wind strong enough to immediately reverse its course. But that's when the newcomer heard the sound that heralded his victory. The Saori gasped for breath. He was getting tired. In his hubris, the newcomer didn't see that the Saori moved his right hand, the one wearing the ring, behind his body, preventing the newcomer from noticing when the rune was activated. And for the second time that day, the newcomer was knifed in the back, this time in a spot too difficult for him to reach. The newcomer grunted in pain and fell onto one knee. The Saori grinned and stepped forward, calling a knife to fly into his grip, ready to stab the newcomer in the back of the neck. But before the knife trajectory could complete, he felt his feet get pulled forward, and as he fell onto his back he saw that the newcomer held in each hand one end of his whip, the rest of its length being used to trip the Saori. The newcomer forced himself past his pain and leapt on top of the Saori, reached into the bag of his left hip and produced the head of a noose, and fitted it over the Saori's head. The Saori attempted to get up, but the newcomer, still on top of the Saori, elbowed him in the face, causing the back of his head to smash into the ground below. Whomever made the Saori's enchanted ring was smart enough to realize that spending energy to protect its wearer from the ground was a waste of mana. The newcomer scrambled to his feet and began running, pulling more of the noose out of his bottomless bag as he did so, ensuring the rope was never more or less than one tug away from becoming taut. The Saori got up just in time to see the newcomer leave the field of knives and grin as he gave the noose a pull. The Saori was lulled forwards and smashed his face on the ground, and struggled as he was pulled towards the newcomer. "You're not accomplishing anything, you idiot. I can still breathe." The Saori shouted, recalling a knife and beginning to cut through the noose. The newcomer said nothing as he pulled, then as soon as the Saori had cut himself free he rushed forward and with another crack used his whip to send the Saori's knife flying. The newcomer took more rope out of his bottomless bag and kicked the Saori's head into the ground once more, buying himself enough time to kneel on top of the Saori's back and use his rope to tie the Saori's arms together, the tightness of the rope causing the shielding enchantment to strain, its green hue becoming brighter. The newcomer knew the fight was over. There were no knives between him and the Saori, who was now in no position to fight. All he had to do was tire out the Sauri, then land the killing blow. The newcomer raised up his whip to begin pelting the Sauri, when the ring flashed blue brighter than ever before. The newcomer realized almost too late that if the ring could recall one knife at a time, it could likely recall all the knives at once. He quickly dove out of the way of the flood of steel coming his way, but not fast enough to avoid two embedding themselves into his left leg. The Sauri laughed as the magical shielding disappeared, the mass recall of knives making him too tired to continue feeding the ring the mana it needed. He slowly got up to his knees, then to his feet, and began to walk over to the newcomer. "Well, looks like I eat whatever you are tonight," the Sauri said, panting between breaths. He grabbed a knife from the ground and slowly staggered to the newcomer, who was prone on the ground, bleeding from his leg where he'd been hit by the flying wave of knives. He was about to land a final blow when he roared in pain as he felt something hit him in the back. He turned around and saw the former blacksmith's son in the middle of the village square, his father's crossbow in his hands. "That's not nay, door, lie," the Sauri said, flinging his knife towards the folk, who didn't have the experience or the reflexes necessary to dodge out of the way. The Sauri chided himself for his bad aim, as it only hit the folk in the shoulder instead of the neck. The folk struggled to reload the weapon, his shoulder robbed of its full strength and mobility. The Sauri debated whether he should take care of the folk first, but he was too tired to make the trip there and back, and ultimately decided to take care of the newcomer first. He turned back to the downed combatant and bent over to pull out the two knives embedded in the newcomer's leg, only to find them missing. Had he been less tired, he might have realized the only reason for their disappearance. The newcomer sat up from his prone position and stabbed the Sauri in the thigh, then reached up and stabbed him in the shoulder, using the leverage from the blades to pull him down onto the ground. The Sauri did his best to push the newcomer away, but the newcomer kept stabbing and screaming and slowly but surely climbed on top of the Sauri. The newcomer then made to bring his knife down onto the Sauri's neck, to finish this once and for all. The Sauri knew he was too weak and tired to grasp the newcomer's wrist. He did the only thing he could. He put his palm between his throat and the knife, and pushed away from his throat with all his might, while the newcomer pushed downwards as hard as he could. The Sauri could feel some of his energy returning, his species healing factor beginning to kick in, and he began to raise the knife higher and higher. The newcomer saw this, and with one grunt of desperation he headbutted the knife, pushing it down mere centimeters. Then he headbutted it again. And again. And again. The newcomer didn't realize that the Sauri was limp until the sixth headbutt. He breathed out a sigh of relief and exhaustion, then reached into his bottomless bag to retrieve a red vial of healing potion, downing half of it and pouring the rest on his many wounds. The newcomer lay on his back, oblivious to the cheers of the townspeople, ignoring the questions from the town healer asking if he was all right. Minutes later he stood up, his leg capable of movement once more, and slowly walked to where he'd dropped his pipe, hat, and torso covering. He packed it with sweet leaf, lit it, and allowed himself a few puffs to celebrate. The newcomer spent the next 20 minutes slowly meandering about the town square, picking up his and the Sauri's knives, thanking any who helped with a simple nod, then made his way to the Sauri's body, cut off his finger, and removed the ring by the shortest path off the dismembered digit, pocketing it for later. Then without a word, he began walking down the road. The townsfolk tried to get him to stop, to stay the night, to drink and feast with them, but the newcomer simply shook his head as he made his way back to his camp on the banks of the river. After an hour of slowly packing up his camp, the newcomer tipped his hat and wordlessly began walking down the road away from Clear River. Shink. 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 Share. Save.